It's hard enough for a band to write a truly great and timeless album, much less when it's their very first one. I'm going to tell you my picks for the greatest debut albums in rock and roll history on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're ever in the Metroplex, please come shop with us. Or if you're in the United States, you can shop with us anytime at ntxvinyl.com for any pre-orders, new vinyl reissues. Would love to have your support there in our online store. Let's talk about the greatest debut rock and roll albums of all time. This is highly debatable. I'm going to show you a list of my top five debut rock albums. This is very hard for me. I do have some backup picks as well, because just whittling this down to five is nearly impossible. But it's fun. It is fun to think about this, and it's a topic that when it comes up gets a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion. So I'm going to kick off with, for me, the album that I instantly think of. If someone says, what's the greatest rock debut? There's only one album that always comes to mind for me because it's the number one. Everything else kind of falls behind that. There's a number one and then there's everything else. And for me, the greatest album, the greatest debut album in rock and roll history is the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Let's talk about why. What qualifies, for me personally, a great debut rock album? I think first and foremost, innovation. I think innovation is incredibly important to me because I'm trying to think, like, what's an album that came out, the band had never been heard of, the musicians had never been heard of on a mainstream level at all, and it came out and it changed the landscape of music. It changed the landscape of culture. It is so iconic in not only sound but also visual, also the historic impact of it, how it's aged, how it sounds now versus then. That's all the type of stuff I think of when I think of what makes a great debut or what makes the greatest debut. So for me, the Jimi Hendrix Experience is that just the ultimate. It's the ultimate debut. Purple Haze, Manic Depressions, Hey Joe, Love or Confusion, May This Be Love, I Don't Live Today, The Wind Cries Mary, Fire, Third Stone from the Sun, Foxy Lady, Are You Experienced? It's a greatest hits in a lot of ways, and it is the Jimi Hendrix album that I would always point to as my favorite Hendrix album. But I would also point to it as, in my opinion, the greatest debut in rock and roll history. Let's talk about that. What am I defining as rock and roll? Well, for me, rock and roll is an umbrella. That means it can be anything that fits underneath that moniker. Not country, not R&B, not soul, not jazz, that type of thing, right? Rock and roll is everything underneath the rock and roll umbrella. So that's what would now be considered classic rock or psychedelic rock. You know, that could be punk, it could be grunge, it could be new wave. Like, that's all underneath kind of the rock and roll umbrella. A big catch-all, right? You could definitely go sub-genre and do greatest debuts there. But I'm saying big picture rock and roll umbrella. What are the greatest debuts? My number one pick right here, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are You Experienced? Right behind that, these are the two I kind of always struggle. I really, like I said, number one is a no-brainer for me personally. And then numbers 2 through 5 could pretty much go in any order. The other thing I'll say about Hendrix, which I think is inspiration. I mean, talk about inspiring not only a generation of guitar players, but will forever be inspiring generations of guitar players, because that's how innovative Jimmy was. That's another big thing. Just influence is huge in the way I think about this. And also, if I'm going to talk about influence, this is probably the number two. But like I said, numbers 2 through 5 can kind of shift around. The debut from Zeppelin, I think, dropped like a bomb. It really did. You've got just an incredible track list. Good Times, Bad Times, You Shook Me, Dazed and Confused, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, Your Time Is Gonna Come, Black Mountain Side, Communication Breakdown, I Can't Quit You Baby, and how many more times. An epic debut album. I don't think it's Zeppelin's best album, but as far as a debut and as far as coming out of the gate with something very strong and sets the course for the band to become, in my opinion, one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever, Zeppelin's debut is always up there, top of my list. So that's number 2. Number 3, I'll go a little punk rock, and for me, I'm going to go the Ramones. I love the Ramones. I love this debut record. I love the vibe of it. I love the story of it. I love how underground the Ramones were for so long, and in a lot of ways still have never gotten the credit they deserved. Such a special album. Let me pull the track list up here just so I can show it to you like I did the others. You got Blitzkrieg Bop, Beat on the Brat, Judy is a Punk, I Want to Be Your Boyfriend, Chainsaw, Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue, I Don't Want to Go Down to the Basement. I mean, that's an incredible side one. Loudmouth, Havana Affair, Listen to My Heart, 53rd and 3rd, Let's Dance, I Don't Want to Walk Around With You, and Today Your Love, Tomorrow the World. An amazing record. Talk about influence. I mean, truly the innovators in the punk genre. I think the way that they took the 3 chords and the truth to heart and put some distortion behind it and a whole lot of speed. I just love, I love the fact that you can trace virtually everything punk back to this album right here. And for me, that creation of an entire genre. I mean, there's other albums and artists that are very influential in punk and right around the same time period, of course. But for me, it's the Ramones. And I think, I mean, if you're going to talk top 3 rock and roll debut albums, pretty good list right there. Pretty good list. So what comes after that for me personally? Those are pretty old school, obviously, timing wise. I get a little more modern on my next 2 picks, a little more modern, but not like modern day. I'm going to go Van Halen 1. I mean, I think this is a no-brainer. Talk about game changer. There's nothing else that sounded like this at the time. Really, there still isn't. I think I love the Van Halen catalog. I like the David Lee Roth era and the Hagar era. I'm one of those guys who can appreciate it all. But this album, pound for pound, Running with the Devil, Eruption, you really got me. Ain't Talking About Love, I'm the One. It's just so strong. You really got me. Jamie's Crying, On Fire, Running with the Devil, Talking About Love, I'm the One, Little Dreamer, Eruption, Ice Cream Man. It's just so good. It's just, it's hard to deny the influence. And again, you can kind of draw the lineage between Hendrix and, would the innovation of Eddie Van Halen exist without the innovation of Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page for that matter? Probably not. And I love that you can kind of trace that over time. As far as coming out of the gate strong, I don't know that it gets that much stronger than Van Halen. But what about Appetite for Destruction? This rounds out my top 5. Man, I was old enough to remember. I was born in 78, so I remember Van Halen 1 a little bit, but I remember Van Halen 2 and getting into like 1984 more. But this one here, I do remember when this came out. I remember hearing it on the radio. Talk about a bomb dropping. Like you just had never heard anything like it. It was so raw, so in your face, so heavy. When it kicks off with Welcome to the Jungle, to this day, I think is probably the best lead-off track ever. That's a different video, but man, Welcome to the Jungle, It's So Easy, Night Train, Out to Get Me, Mr. Brownstone, Paradise City, just Sweet Child of Mine, You're Crazy, Rocket Queen, fantastic record. Talk about kicking off a career. Kind of, everything I said about the others is the same thing here. It's so iconic, the band, this album in particular, and as far as aging well, it sounds as raucous and as in your face today as it did then, which I think is a big component of this for me when I start compiling these lists. I try and listen back to these albums, and I'm listening to anything that sounds dated, that sounds like, oh yeah, you can tell that's from this era. Not really, man. You put on Appetite or any of these other ones, really, and they stand up as well as they did the day they were released. And so that's always top of mind for me is when I'm trying to position these albums or artists and make a list out of them. But so for me, that's the top 5. What do you think of my top 5? Hendrix, Zeppelin, Ramones, Van Halen, and GNR. That's my top 5. So I want to hear your top 5. We can get into naming every album under the sun, and the lists get out of control, and it's hard to manage them. So let's just stick with top 5. So I want to see your top 5 in the comments, and I'm curious how many people agree or disagree with me. I'm confident there will be tons of people that disagree. But let me show you some backup picks. So if I was going to do a top 10, which I'm not, but these are some of the albums that I would be considering for the top 10. You know me, and you know Pearl Jam 10 is going to be on the list because it's a fantastic album, and it definitely, in a lot of ways, changed the course of music. I think in a lot of ways, this as well as Nevermind, early 90s rock, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, etc. But as far as debuts, I mean, that's the thing. When you go with the grunge big 4, Nirvana's best album was not Bleach, in my opinion. Alice in Chains' best album was not Facelift. Soundgarden's album was definitely later in their career. Their best album, Super Unknown or Bad Motorfinger, whatever you want to say their best album is, was way later in their career. But for me, Pearl Jam came out of the gate with 10. Now, it's debatable whether it's their best album, but I think as far as a debut, holds up really, really well. So this would definitely be in the conversation in my top 10. Back to some classic rock. How about Boston? Just plays like a greatest hits. Boston's self-titled. I don't even own another Boston record. This is the only Boston record I need. And for my collection, for my taste, I absolutely love it. Love that record. How about a little Southern rock? Skinner's first record. I mean, I know it's pronounced, but it's the self-titled debut to me. It's just so good. And again, kind of created a genre, You could go back and, there's Allman Brothers, there's Southern rock stuff going on, but this is, I think, the one that puts, this style of classic rock, Southern rock on the map. I love Skinner's debut. I think that's strong. Kind of along the lines of the Ramones debut, I think the Stooges is in this conversation. This is a fantastic record. So unique. So influential on so many bands. Love that record. You're going to have Zeppelin on a list. Why not have Sabbath on a list? I mean, pretty incredible stuff right here. Love this record. Fantastic debut. Something a little more 80s. The Cars. This is a fantastic debut. 78, but I think of Cars as an 80s band, even though the debut was in 78. I think this one's kind of like Boston to me. Just plays like a greatest hits all the way through. Just dominated radio. Still sounds great. Still sounds very fresh in my opinion. I think these songs and Rick Ocasek's songwriting and the production on this is just fantastic. And then, you got the Clash, more punk. So you got the Ramones, Clash, the Stooges, those bands really establishing that sound and that genre. So those would be ones that I would have in contention if I was going to go top 10. But top 5 again: Hendrix, Zeppelin, Ramones, Van Halen, and GNR. Those would be my top 5 for the greatest debut rock and roll albums of all time. I would love to hear your opinions. I want to see your list. Put it in the comments, and I'll do my best to go through there and give some feedback and critique, because I know that's what you're going to do for my list. So thanks as always. This has been a fun one. We'll see you again soon. My name is G.I. Sanders, and we'll be back with another episode of Talking About Records here on the NTX Vinyl YouTube channel.